Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brandon Selinsky, and this is ESOP is No Fable. I am here to talk to you about ESOPs. So if you want to know about employee ownership, you're in the right place. Before I get into our agenda here, let me just tell you a little bit about who's talking to you. As I mentioned, my name is Brandon Selinsky. I am an attorney with Beer Law HQ. We are the beer law wing of Whitcomb Selinsky PC. We're a fairly small law firm out here in Denver, Colorado. We operate mostly in the area of government contracts and administrative law, which suits us perfectly to do all things for breweries. Most things that breweries need in terms of legal needs have to do with interaction with the government, interaction with employees. We have a robust employee law wing here. OSHA and the like. So we do everything. We're one-stop shopping for employees. Again, that's Beer Law HQ. So today we're going to be talking about ESOPs. And the roadmap here is, first of all, why should you engage in ESOP? What are the benefits? What are the ups? What are the downs? Number two, the downs. Why shouldn't you? And then finally, I'm going to give a couple of examples, comparative case studies and ESOPs in the wild, a couple different breweries that have gone this route. With that, oops, pardon me. There we go. Why should I ESOP? So first of all, what is an ESOP? An ESOP is an employee stock ownership plan. This is an employee benefit plan that allows you to pass ownership of your brewery onto your employees. And ESOP is it's a tax vehicle primarily. It's a tax vehicle for the transfer of ownership of a business. You can create an ESOP to take advantage of certain tax implications that are afforded to those kinds of vehicles, to ESOPs. And you can do that to do something that you are going to do anyway. That is transfer the ownership of your brewery. And if you do that, if you use that vehicle, if you transfer ownership under an ESOP, you'll have a lower tax burden. That's the primary advantage. The secondary advantage, but just as impactful, is that it should help with employee retention and motivation. As I mentioned, it's an employee benefit plan, so it's packaged up as something for employees. It benefits everybody top to bottom. And it does that if you're an operation that can benefit from an ESOP. So ESOPs are not for everybody. We'll talk a little bit more about what they are and how they're created and whether or not your brewery might benefit from one. ESOPs are not a silver bullet for a struggling brewery, for example. They're not likely to be the solitary thing that will provide funding for your next location or for expansion. They're a careful, intentional tool for businesses to decrease their tax burden and reward employees who stick around. You have to put the work in. It's not all that different from brewing, actually. ESOPs are something that are you really benefit from your own fastidiousness as brewers do. So if you are somebody that can pay some careful attention to detail, you learn the rules, you follow those rules, and you can reap the rewards. So that's basically what an ESOP is. Let's see, I think we covered all the bullet points here. So let's go over each one of these things. In terms of succession planning, an ESOP is sort of a ready-made path for an owner, oftentimes a founder, to liquidate his or her interest in the brewery. So there are obviously a multitude of other options for liquidating. You can sell to another brewery, private individual. You can sell to family members. You can sell to a private equity firm. Lots of different ways you can get out of the game and hopefully make some money doing it. And ESOP is one way to do that. And it's kind of a ready-made path for doing that. It's not often going to be as lucrative as private equity, for example. So there's some advantages and disadvantages. Private equity has the advantage of paying whatever it wants for the stocks, for the stock shares. ESOPs has to pay an ESOP when an employee cashes out. They have to pay fair market value for those stocks. The brewery can make tax-deductible cash contributions to ESOP. And I'll talk more about the tax implications later, but this is one of them. So they can make tax-deductible cash contributions to the ESOP to buy out an owner's share, or it can have the ESOP borrow that money to buy the shares. And we'll talk about why that loan is going to be really important in realizing an advantage for an ESOP. And then secondly, the second major purpose for setting up an ESOP is employee motivation and retention. So I have on here some of the findings from this Rutgers study from 2020. So a couple years ago, employees conducted Rutgers conducted a study of employee-owned businesses and how they were performing during the pandemic compared to non-employee-owned businesses. And I'll note out front that this study was paid for by an operation called the Employee Ownership Foundation. So they have a bit of a stake in the game, and you want to take this with a grain of salt. But what they found was that employee-owned businesses were 3 to 4 times more likely to retain non-manager and manager employees, 3.2 times more likely to retain staff, and significantly less likely to reduce employees' hours or pay. That's all pretty great. There are other advantages that are sort of squishier advantages, I would call them. They're advantages in productivity, in maintaining the culture of the operation. And there are just an untold number of studies. So you start all of these conversations with studies show, and you can find a study that's going to show that there's an increase in productivity. And I'm not saying that there's not, but most of those studies seem to be funded, again, by operations that would stand to gain, like the Employee Ownership Foundation. So take them with a grain of salt, but the studies do show that ESOPs can improve productivity once that ESOP is installed. And then the third reason that you'd want to stand up an ESOP is that it sort of goes along with the first one, the retirement and succession planning. But you get to borrow money at a lower after-tax cost. And it's notable that an ESOP is the only qualified retirement plan in the United States that can borrow money. So if you're going to use some other vehicle, if you're going to use an IRA or something like that as a motivation for your employees, you can't borrow money for those, and they have different implications. We'll talk about we'll do kind of a side-by-side comparison later. Let's see, some of the other tax advantages that are here. I mean, you can kind of read them off the page, but I'll talk about the capital gains tax. Owners may be able to defer capital gains tax on the sale of their shares to the ESOP. So if you're comparing the sale of your brewery to private equity as an alternative, consider what that deal looks like. So consider what that deal looks like with deferring capital gains versus not being able to do that. It's not just academic. You might be able to put yourself in a better place by going through an ESOP, and it's just something that you have to sit down and crunch numbers on. Employees can defer their tax on their stock interest, which is a lot like some other vehicles. That's not a huge advantage over some other kinds of employee benefit programs. Let's move on to how it works. So how do you set up an ESOP? And let's see, I just want to check the screen and see if there's any questions. No questions yet. All right. So we're going to keep going. Step number one is you set up an ESOP trust fund, and that's pretty straightforward. There are different ways that you can do that, but you're setting up a trust fund. So that's one of the more straightforward parts of the process. Step two, the ESOP is going to acquire shares to the company, and you do have some options there. So there are two main ways that you can do this. Number one, the company can contribute shares of its own stock or cash to buy those shares. Or number two, the ESOP can borrow the money, and again, that's going to be you're going to have a better tax advantage if you do that, to buy the new or existing shares. The company can thereafter make the cash contributions to service that debt. Third, the shares are allocated to the employees. How is that done? Generally, the full-time employees who are 21 and over will be the employees that will participate. And there are some exceptions. I won't get into what the exceptions are here, but if that was a stopping point for you, you'd want to look into whether you might be able to take advantage of some of those exceptions. For example, if a lot of your employees are under 21. Allocations can be made on the basis of relative pay or some other more equal formula. So relative pay is not always the most equal formula, and obviously depends on how you pay your employees and what that structure is. But there are other ways that you can devise those allocations. And you should note that as you go along, your more senior employees are going to be more vested and are going to have more shares. And so that's going to come up again when we compare that to profit sharing. And then third, there's a vesting schedule. And this is how you can, this is really the motivation for employees to stick around, to embrace the culture of the brewery, and to realize some ownership of it. Because when an employee is vested, that means that so goes the brewery, so goes the value of their shares. So anyway, let's talk about the vesting schedule. When an employee finally has a right to the benefit, that's what the vesting is. The stock shares that their account is credited with through the ESOP, they finally get to realize those. So if they vested after 2 years, for example, they will have a certain number of shares. And if they want to retire, if they want to get out of the game at that point, they can do that, and they can cash in the shares that they have vested. Number two, as employees' seniority increases, they acquire an increasing right to their shares in their account. That's significant in a couple of ways. As I just mentioned, the more senior employees are going to have a greater share. That might mean that they take greater ownership of their job. It might mean that they feel more connected to the company. It might not. It's still true that even if you're not a senior member of your staff, of the brewery staff, you're going to have some interest in those shares, and it's in your best interest to make sure that the brewery succeeds. And we'll talk about a little bit later how that's different from profit sharing, at least in some way. And then number three, employees must be 100%. This is one of the rules that you're going to have. Now it's here on the bottom. Employees are going to have to be 100% vested within 3 to 6 years, depending on whether vesting is all at once, which is called a cliff vesting schedule, or gradually over time. And so there are minimum standards. This is another area where you can set it up as you want, as long as within a couple of different parameters. So let's talk about what those parameters are. No vesting in the first years. All right, so yeah, we talked about what those two things are. So the second one is the minimum standard here would be the 20% vesting after the second year of service, with 20% more each year until 100% vesting occurs within the 6th year of service. You can be more generous than that to your employees. So you could say 30% after your second year of service, or you could vest after the first year, but this is a minimum standard. All right, so lastly, employees receive their stock when they leave the company, and the company then must buy back that stock at its fair market value, unless there's a public market for the shares. I'm not sure that there have been any breweries that have been publicly traded when they've been employee owned. We'll talk about New Belgium a little bit later, and kind of what they went through and got bought up. They weren't publicly owned, they were just employee owned. So for the most part, we're going to be concerned with buying back those shares. And again, that's a significant part of this, and it's I think where a brewery can really benefit from a plan, a long-term plan as to how the stock share buyback is going to work, and when that's going to happen, what employees they have, when they're likely to retire, those kinds of things. You can commission a study to do that. That's in your best interest, and that goes to some of the overhead that comes with setting up an ESOP. But again, it's a little bit further in the presentation. So what are the downsides? I've talked about what an ESOP is and what are some of the advantages, what are some of the disadvantages. The repurchase liability, which is what I was just getting into. The repurchase liability is you have, when you launch that ESOP, you're going to have a vesting schedule. And let's say it's 6 years, an employee is 100% vested. So you know that after 6 years, an employee doesn't have an advantage to gain for their vesting. They're 100% in it at that point, and they can cash out all of their shares. And so you want to keep that in mind, and know how many employees are on that schedule and when they're going to hit their 6th year. Doesn't mean that they're going to quit at that point. I can't afford to quit my job after 6 years. That'd be fantastic. But the point is that some of that motivation is going to drop off after that 100% investing. So when that happens, and this happened to New Belgium, you're going to have a certain amount of buyback liability, and you want to make sure you plan for that. If you don't, you might need some other funding. You might need to look at your operations and make sure that that's going to be consistent with the kind of payout that you're going to need to make when you have employees retiring. I mentioned before that ESOPs can only pay fair market value for stock shares. That's a disadvantage in terms of you might be able to get a higher price tag for each of your shares if you go through private equity. However, the tax benefits, the tax deferments, that might equal something that's a better advantage when you combine it with some of these other advantages. So you can only get fair market value for your shares through an ESOP. There's some overhead. Again, as I just mentioned, there's a lot of administrative costs in terms of setting up the ESOP. So one of the things I love about the brewing industry is that it's very DIY. And I think that's fantastic. I'm a DIY guy. Not great at all things. I tried to fix a toilet last night, and it took me like an hour because I didn't have the right tool and didn't totally know what I was doing. So a toilet you can kind of stumble through. An ESOP, I would not stumble through. An ESOP it's heavily regulated. It's controlled by a couple different acts, a couple different laws, and you want to be compliant with all those things in order to take advantage of those tax consequences. And if you don't, if you are flawed in how you set it up, then you're not going to get those tax advantages. And what's the point at that point? So there are some administrative costs, not just in setting it up, but also in making sure that your employees are able to cash out, making sure they get those shares vested, and making sure that somebody's tracking all that. There's a limited availability. I think this is not a big disadvantage, actually. The limited availability is that an ESOP is only available to a corporation that is a C Corp or an S Corp. And if you don't know what those are, I'm happy to talk to you after the presentation about that. But you can't, you would not be able to get one for an LLC pardon me, that's not true. You would not be able to get one for a limited partnership or something like that. It's got to be a C Corp or an S Corp. And you set those designations up with the IRS. So don't worry about what your structure looks like so much with the state. You set those things up with the IRS. And if you're not one of those, if you open as a partnership, for example, and you're not an S Corp, you can change. It's easy enough to transfer into an S Corp or C Corp if you want to set up an ESOP. So that's a disadvantage that people talk about when they're talking about ESOPs. It's not a big one. It's easily fixable. And then lastly, it is heavily regulated. Again, as I just mentioned, it's a creature of statute. The ESOP is. You want to be compliant in order to realize the advantage. Okay, so I've inadvertently kind of gone over most of the comparisons, but let's talk about real quick a comparison of profit sharing versus ESOPs. Profit sharing, first of all, you have the advantage of profit sharing is that you could set it up really any way you want. That's not illegal. I mean, it's not a creature of statute. You can set it up with got greater options in terms of vesting schedules, in terms of how you want that bonus structure to look and who's going to get it. So you've got more freedom to move, but you don't get the same tax advantages. And that's really kind of what it boils down to, is that the profit sharing is not a creature of statute, even though there are certain regulations you want to abide by. The ESOP, and the other part of it is that an employee is looking at that profit sharing year after year. So there might be a vesting schedule, but you're kind of looking at, what are we going to do this year? How great are we going to be how productive are we going to be this year? And because that's usually how the bonus structure is, that's how it looks. It's based on a year. Whereas an ESOP, you want to build on your improvements year after year, because you're building towards that retirement, and you want those shares to maximize their value at the end of them. So to any employee that's considering looking at a brewery that has a profit sharing plan versus an ESOP, there are some significant advantages with the ESOP, but again, ESOPs don't make sense for everybody. So you kind of want to look at what you can afford to do at the time and what you can afford to do over time, and see which one of those is going to work better for you. All right, so this is the ESOPs in the wild. And actually, before we do that, I want to talk one more thing about rules. I keep mentioning that the ESOPs are creatures of statute, and that you need to abide by the rules or you're doomed. And that's true. But the question is, what are those rules? The rules are legion. It's a pile of statutes that you have to abide by, which seems kind of intimidating at first. It's not. Again, you want to find somebody who knows how to do this to walk you through it. And you probably have a team where you'll have an attorney, a CPA or a CFO that can navigate these waters. And then if you're going to take out a loan, you want the bank. You want a bank who knows what an ESOP is, and again, can kind of make sure that you're following all the rules. Some of those rules are the interest deductions. Interest deductions for the business are limited to 30% of EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's true for 4 years, and then that limit decreases to 30% of EBIT, which is all of that minus the depreciation and amortization. And you want to keep in mind that for an S Corp, S Corps are pass-through entities, so they don't pay tax anyway. So it doesn't really apply to, that rule doesn't apply to S Corps. Secondly, there must be an annual third-party valuation to determine the shares. This goes to overhead. You need to hire a third party to come in and value the company every year. Also, in terms of private companies, employees must be able to vote their allocated shares on major issues, such as closing or relocating or opening another location. New Belgium, when they were employee-owned, they voted on becoming a wind-powered brewery, on being a B Corp, and even on selling out. I don't mean to say selling out, on selling to Lion. That's something that they voted on doing, and as we'll see in a second, there was certainly an advantage to the employees for that. So there are lots more rules. Those are some of the big ones, and it's just a matter of coloring within the lines. All right, so ESOPs in the wild. This is just a case study. So a comparison between New Belgium Brewery and Harpoon Brewery. New Belgium, of course, is in Fort Collins here in Colorado, and they launched in, they opened in 1991. And in 2000, they became the first 100%, employee. In 2000, they launched their ESOP. In 2012, they became the first 100% employee-owned brewery. And they're fun to look at because they are an exception to a lot of the conventional wisdom about ESOPs, but they're also good examples of what can be done, what can be accomplished through ESOPs. They, so amongst other things, they sold out. And I'll say it now. They sold out. They sold out to Lion, which is a subsidiary of Kirin. So they sold out to a big company, but they voted to do that. And at the time, they were the fourth largest craft brewery. The sale meant that they're no longer employee-owned, but their employees got paid, and any employee that was a stock owner got paid. So that was a way of cashing out sooner than they had anticipated. Kim Jordan, who was one of the founders, published a letter, and this was a letter to fans, fans like me. So one of the things that she was trying to do, I think, was just say, hey, it's okay. Well, we did sell, and this is what that looked like for us and for our employees, amongst other things. And there's a great quote that I have here, which is in tiny print, but I'll just read it off. More than 300 employees are receiving over $100,000 of retirement money, with some receiving significantly greater amounts. Over the life of our ESOP, including this transaction, the total amount paid to current and former employees will be nearly $190 million. That's a lot of money. I think that that's a good example of what's probably an exception. Find me another brewery that is an ESOP that their former employees are going to benefit to the tune of $190 million. Can't be too many. So it might be an exception, but the employees were able to steer the ship on that one. They were able to say that they wanted to cash out. And there was, a little bit of drama that went along with that that I won't get into. But it's, they're no longer an ESOP. They're still around. Their employees are, still employed. And I have a couple stats here just as a point of comparison. So I pulled these from the internet. I don't know how reliable these numbers are, but they seem to make sense with the numbers that New Belgium has reported over time. But they have 814 employees and the revenue of $307.7 million. So they're still doing okay even after employee ownership. One of the criticisms of ESOPs is that they are a limited run vehicle. And that's one of the things that Kim Jordan mentioned. She mentioned that one of the driving forces behind the acquisition was New Belgium's demands of its ESOP and selling shareholders needed to be, demands of its ESOP and selling shareholders needed to be balanced with its need to raise capital. So it had that buyback liability that was growing and they needed to raise capital and they felt squeezed. So Lion came along and provided a solution to that. And they took it. So that buyback liability is real. And I bring it up again because it was mentioned in the sale of New Belgium, but also if you do some research on ESOPs and how long they last, that's a common theme, is that they might last a certain amount of time when that buyback liability gets too great. If you haven't planned well enough, if you don't have some things in place, and if you're not, honestly, a little bit of luck goes a long way, then you might find yourself squeezed and it might be difficult to keep operating as an ESOP. So that's another thing that you should consider when you're planning. What does the future look like? And that's why I say it's helpful to have a good team who's done this before, and you can map out what this looks like over time, over a long period of time. So compare that with Harpoon. So Harpoon established their ESOP in 2014. And as far as I can tell, they're still 48% employee owned. And you can tell me I'm wrong about that. I might be, but that was the best information I could find. So still employee owned at 48%, which means 52% is not part of the ESOP. It can be. The ESOP can buy those shares. And they can eventually become 100% owned. And that was something I didn't mention that New Belgium had done. When they first launched in 2000, they launched as I think like a 41% employee-owned ESOP. They ramped that up to 100% in 2012 into 2013. So Harpoon is still employee-owned. They're another company that you can find a lot of information about in terms of how proud they are of being employee owned. So they're a good example of how this can last. It's now 8 years later, they're still employee owned. They have annual revenue of $146.5 million and 434 employees. So in terms of employees, about half the size of New Belgium. In terms of revenue, less. So about half. So a little less than half. So they're sort of tracking in terms of those metrics. But again, if you want to look at an example of an ongoing ESOP that seems to be doing pretty well, and by all accounts from them, they do a good job of explaining some of those softer benefits. They put out some videos and some articles about. I think there was one narrative or anecdote where an employee said that, not since they became employee owned, if they see a piece of trash in the parking lot, they pick it up, and that's great. It's it might be a small advantage by itself, but it does sort of make that illustration about how employees are more in tune with what's happening in the brewery. Lots of other breweries have gone this way. I think there are at least 15 breweries right now that are employee owned. I don't know how current that number is, but Left Hand here in Colorado, Modern Times out in San Diego, Odell also up in Fort Collins. So a lot of breweries have gone that way, and you can kind of look at them. I like looking at case studies to see how things play out. so that you can learn from other people's mistakes or try to take advantage of their learning curve. All right, that is it for my presentation on ESOPs. Are there any questions out there? You can write them in the chat. I'll read them out and answer them to the best of my ability. I'll give it about 60 seconds for anybody to write in. In the meantime, I hope everyone's enjoying virtual CBP. I was at the live CBP in Virginia a few weeks ago. I met a few folks. This is a great group, very supportive. So if you have questions during these presentations, don't hold back. Everyone I've seen present has done a great job. And Andrew does a wonderful job of finding different specialties and people with different backgrounds to kind of fill in the knowledge base here. All right, I don't see any questions, so thank you all very much for watching. If you do have any questions in the future and you want to get a hold of me, I should have put this up before, but here's my information. Brandon Selinsky from Beer Law HQ. Look forward to hearing from you. Take care.